In March of 2018, uh, my wife announced that she was pregnant with our fifth son, who would eventually be named John Cassian. Fifth child, third son, John Cassian, and and I almost immediately went and sat down and wrote this poem, and this poem was the first poem I wrote of what has since become the most fruitful time in my career as a poet. Just poetry, the writing of poetry, ever since I wrote this poem, has just been part of my everyday life in a way that it wasn't up until 2018. Poems were much harder for me to come by back then, whereas now I just have come to be able to live in the conversation of poetry all the time, and I'm a much happier man for that. To an unborn child. Storm clouds move in and darken all the house. The morning paper on the kitchen table dim, where I've been reading some reporter's grouse at things already bad, now growing grim. Most of the prodigies agree with him. I rise to light a lamp and hear the thunder and watch the first drops thudding on the lawn. Your mother joins me. Here we stand in wonder between the hour that marks your life's first dawn and that one still obscure we're counting on.
Obviously an appropriate, prelude to a period of poetic fecundity and to a book of poems. I wanted to ask a bit about another formal question, and this poem, like much of your work, is in iambic pentameter, and much of obviously a great deal of English poetry. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about your argument for why iambic pentameter is natural, a very natural, perhaps the most natural meter for English?
Yes. So when people talk about verse and scansion and prosody, and by people, I don't just mean your English teacher or the average person. I mean also some of the 20th century's best poets in English. They often talk in dualistic terms, as if there were meter, and that's one kind of rhythm, and then speech rhythm, and that these two irreconcilable or disparate things are brought together by force in the act of writing a poem. But that's not a accurate description of what verse has been historically or what it does. Every prosody, that is to say, every form of meter or measurement in every language, looks to one or the other prominent morphological features of the language, structural features of the language, and brings those things to order to make verse. So in English, unless we're talking in a complete, deadly, robotic monotone, we all stress, in an irregular pattern, alternate stressed and unstressed syllables, or relatively stressed and unstressed syllables. We say saxophone, stress, unstress, stress. We say trumpet, stress, unstress. We say Timothy, there we go, stress, unstress, stress. You don't say Timothy, which would be wrenching the stress of the words. The semi-regular alteration of stress, relative stress, and relative unstressed syllables is just a feature of our language, even in the most minute things like into. In and to, such small little particulate of words, and yet there's more stress usually on into, although some people say into. And both are actually historically acceptable pronunciations, but in no case, it's either into or into. That is to say, even in this small little word, there's a choice to be made between how it's stressed. And right. We make those choices routinely just as native speakers of English, speaking our words. We don't even think about it. We just do it. All meter does is take that natural property of the language and brings it into regular order, so that instead of irregular up and down movements, we just have a slightly more regularized one. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Now, the meter I just played out there would be an iambic tetrameter, and in much, not to say all of our music, from the simplest children's song to sacred hymns of the church to folk songs and ballads to popular rock music and pop music, most of that work will have something like a 4-beat line. Right? So, let all mortal flesh keep silence. Bum, 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 bum. There's a tetrameter, okay? There's one. Or Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. An even easier one to hear. It's a ballad measure.
Right.
Okay? So, when we hear units of 4, we tend to hear a musical structure. And so all the poetic forms that are either in units of 4 and 3 or some combination thereof per line, 4 stresses, 3 stresses per line, or in a ballad meter you combine the 4. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. That's not how you want to pronounce it to make the poem sound good, but it is how you want to pronounce it if you want to emphasize the meter.
Right.
Any unit of 4 or 3 is going to sound fairly musical to us. And if the poet is very careful to keep his words tied entirely to those linear units of 4 and 3, or 4 and 4 and 4, or 3 and 3 and 3, and so on and so forth, you will hear human speech as sounding intrinsically musical, and it almost wants to leap into song. But if you just add one additional metrical foot onto that 4 stress line, it can still be musical, but it can also become incredibly supple and subtle, and can therefore become flexible enough so that it can accommodate music, but it can also stretch out towards refined rhetoric, or even towards the plainest of speech. Give money me, take friendship, whoso list, says Barnaby Googe in one of our earliest lyric poems. A very plain statement right there, though not at all rhetorically unimpressive. Or to be or not to be, that is the question, whether, so on and so forth from there.
Right.
By just adding that little foot on there, we take the metrical properties that make song possible, sung possible, and rather than denying it its song-like properties, we make it flexible enough that it can become any kind of speech. And so pentameter is the ultimate of flexible lines in English.
Right.
But there's one last, little codicil we have to add there. Well, if we understand 4 is more song-like, and so 5 might be capable of being more flexible and more prosaic when the need arises, well, why not 6? Why not 7?
Right.
As soon as you get to 6, it becomes possible to split the line down the middle with a pause, and then you have units of 3 and 3, so you're back where you started again. You can't break a 10-syllable line evenly in iambic pentameter, because if you break the 10 syllables right down the middle, one half of the line will have 3 stresses, and the other half will have 2, even if they have the same number of syllables. And so the pentameter line is sort of maximally flexible without ever tempting us to fall into a certain kind of monotony or repetition that we hadn't anticipated. You can make it repetitions, and rhythmic, and that's good. Can be a good thing to do, but it doesn't structurally, it's not conducive to that.
Right. Yeah. And I might have said that the purely accent based rather than number of syllable based, tradition of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English verse is more native to English. But you made a good case in The Fortunes of Poetry that it's this ability to that this is, even though it's brought in from other continental European languages, the syllable number based verse combined with the accent is natural to English because it allows for this. I guess is it that you think it allows for a greater what do you think the syllable count unlocks? Not specifically iambic pentameter, but when added to a purely accentual verse. that
it
even though
is
it comes from other languages, unlocks something that's native to English.
Yes, it does. Yes. So first of all, it's native to English to alternate stressed syllables, and as you say, Anglo-Saxon verse with its rough rim ram, as Chaucer put it, accent highlights the accented syllables. There are several things that iambic pentameter, or just the iambic line, brings to English verse that a purely accentual line that's only attending to accents and not to accent and syllable count simultaneously. There are several things it brings. One of them is this. It's the purpose of verse to be a medium. And a medium, typically, is better the more it can serve as medium for. So, in other words, if I want to look at the world through a lens, I want a clear lens so that all colors will come through it. If I have a rose-tinted lens, then only some bandwidths of light are capable of coming through. The medium of the lens is limited in what it can show me. It's going to give everything a pink hue. Okay? And so I won't be perceptive of some colors, and some colors will be distorted. Accentual meter, even though it sounds as if it would be more flexible, because it's only counting accents, in fact is less flexible, and it's less flexible in two respects. First of all, it sounds harsher to our ears. And so it's especially good at expressing harsh sounding things. It has a certain Germanic guttural quality to it. And so there are certain kinds of softer expression that it's incapable of speaking. Mm-hmm. The other thing is this. If you were working in a purely accentual line, then you have to be careful to make sure that your reader can hear where the accents are, because the unstressed syllables aren't doing any of the work for you. In an iambic line, on the other hand, even a very lightly stressed syllable can still be counted as one of the stressed syllables. So as in into. That would be a very light iamb right there. But it would count for stress. And so poets who work in accentual meters, either all the time or some of the time, actually have to be careful to make sure that their stresses are always falling on sort of weight-bearing words, as opposed to the greater flexibility that iambic pentameter allows us, or iambic measure in general allows us, where even lightly stressed words can still count as an ictus, a metrical stress. I was reflecting on this just the other day because I've been spending the last several months rereading my favorite poet of the 20th century, Richard Wilbur's poems. And Wilbur loved to experiment in purely accentual meters. There are two famous poems of his, one called Junk, one called Lilies, are both written in imitation Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse, but he has all kinds of other well-known poems that are counting accents but not metrical feet. His most famous poem, Love Calls Us to the Things of This World, for instance, is a blank accentual pentameter poem. And then another poem of his that's highly regarded by a broad readership is one called The Writer, where he writes in an accentual units of lines of 3, 5, 3, without any rhyme to guide the poems. That's also blank. And those are great poems, but Wilbur has to do things in those poems that he might have been disinclined to do with a more flexible meter, including that all the stresses fall on nouns and verbs, because otherwise the reader just won't hear them. Whereas in pentameter, any stress, however light, can possibly serve as a metrical stress for the purposes of making the line. And so that allows you to say all kinds of things that you just can't say in accentual verse. Right. It's a pure medium. It doesn't impose substance on you.
I would have said that Anglo-Saxon verse had sort of like a virile vigor to it, you know. Yeah. But now that you say it, I can see how the accents, because they're less regular, have a more violent kind of feel to them, more like a riding on a bumpy, a wagon on a bumpy road or something. It's sort of like bum ba da da bum 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 ba da bum, kind of like it. They don't come on exact beats necessarily. So
I would be content with just saying, describe it however you will. The fact is, you can describe it. You can describe what that rhythm is capable of doing, of the connotations that its sound gives to us, of virility, of roughness, of violence. Any of those things is plausible. Iambic pentameter doesn't do that. It's
Right.
And it doesn't do it in itself. You can make it sound rough.
Right.
Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, overthrow me and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new, says Chuck.
Right. That almost sounds like a Hopkins or something,
That's
even though
just
it's
good
in strict
pentameter,
meter.
though. Yeah, it's John Donne. But
Yeah.
yep.